I'm François Knuchel, calling from London, and I'm going to give a brief about a 30-minute presentation on sort of the sociocracy in the context of complexity. And then there'll be about 10-15 minutes just for a Q&A if necessary, and then there'll be another time for another 30 minutes for in smaller groups to have a dialogue and to lead the dialogue a bit further in smaller groups. So I'm keenly interested in complexity, but I'm not claiming to be a specialist in complexity. It's something I've been sort of looking into more depth more recently, because complexity in many ways addresses what's going on in the world at the moment. And it's also related to systems thinking, to VUCA. I mean, complexity is one of the VUCA, it's the C of VUCA, living systems and so on. And I'm just going to give a very, very potted history of complexity science as it relates to organizations and leadership. But I first want to start just by giving the conclusions I've come to. So I'm going to start with the conclusions and come back to them at the very end, so that you know where I'm leading to. So the conclusions I've come to, that in general, we as sociocrats or sociocrats, we are slightly undervalue the benefits of sociocracy. The benefits are far beyond just governance and decision and all the things we know. There are other benefits, and I will talk about those. At the same time, however, it would be wrong to think that sociocracy is the be-all and end-all of organizing. In fact, complexity shows there are certain limits that sociocracy cannot address. And if we're aware of those limits, then we can apply sociocratic thinking in a more empowering way. So that's my purpose. And when I speak of sociocracy, but I in a very broad sense. So that would include holacracy, S3, and all the derivatives. It's not. It's a more broader context. So I'll start with a very, very, very potted history. So 100 years ago, contemporary of what was then the creators, the architects of scientific and dehumanized management, so people like Frederick Taylor, Max Weber, and so on, there was a contemporary called Mary Parker Follett. And so, oh yeah, here we are. Sorry. And she published an article in the early part of the century called, amongst many other articles, I should say, Community is a Process, in which she wrote that those who operate in organizations as agents, and that's mainly people, influence each other dynamically and interdependently in such a way as to create a community which is not only more than the sum of the parts, but which is also constantly evolving. And hence, that's why she calls it a process. Now, at that time when she wrote, complexity science did not exist in any shape or form, but she could just as well have been written directly out of complexity. So in many respects, especially her concept of interdependence, in many respects, she was way ahead of her time. She was also pre-warning of the follies of some of her contemporaries, and offered a living system, organic sort of perspective, which was unusual at the time, given the very mechanistic approach that most others were taking. But being a woman, unfortunately, was ignored, and I believe that had she been listened to back then, the world would be a very different place today. Now, around the same time, science had just debunked classical science or classical physics, which is mainly Newtonian physics, and there were two incompatible theories that existed side by side. One was the theory of relativity, the other was quantum theory, and the two existed. And some people may have heard of the double slits theory, or experiment rather, and the fact that the observer cannot be separated from the observed. But those two theories coexisted without resolution. They contradicted each other in some respects. I won't go to the details. But that situation existed all the way throughout most of the last century until David Bohm, and others too, of course, but David Bohm predominantly came forward, and he just couldn't believe that these two theories could be coexisting and yet not be connected in some way or another. And that's what he researched. And he so postulated there must be some underlying patterns, which he called hidden variables, which create what he calls an implicate order. But in order to find that, he had to go beyond pure physics or beyond pure matter and energy. In fact, he found it through including consciousness. So consciousness is suddenly part of the equation in a way that was never before. So we're bringing a new phenomenon, which is something intangible, into the equation. And without going to the detail, basically, the way he could access that was through interactions in dialogue. And dialogue involves flow of meaning between several interlocutors, which can create a new reality. So reality is not something which is out there, nor is it something that we imagine, but it's something that is co-created by the perception and the interactivity of all the people, of us, basically, of the people. So Bohm is important partly because he revolutionized the relationship between the interaction and the word we co-create, so interdependence, and partly because his theories, which were mathematically expressed, were the inspiration for a lot of other theories that we're more familiar with, such as the most famous one probably is U theory. Otto Scharmer's U theory has its roots in Bohm. And one of the things that's key there is becoming aware of that it enables one to become aware of one's own assumptions. So the Bohm dialogues, as sometimes called, have got they've got in order to enable them, they've got no outcome, they've got no agenda, no moderator. It's a flow of meaning, it's regenerative and creates emergence. Essentially, that's sort of the prerequisite to enable sort of those dialogues. Now, at this point, I want to point out that, in my view at least, there are two forms of interaction, or two forms of communication. One form, which I call debate and discussion, is very much anchored in individualism, where the observer is a separate being who can win. And competition is normally what it's about. So winning the argument is valued. The aim is to beat the adversary. So a lot of debate and discussion centers around that, and is very much anchored in an either-or kind of thinking. On the other side, you've got dialogue and conversation, which is what Bohm was talking about, based on the interaction of the people, where the observer and the observed are basically one and co-create, integrating multiple perspectives and reconciling, transcending into regenerative emergence. So it's more anchored on both and thinking. And so examples of debate and discussion, or either or thinking, of course, is government or the opposition. We've got the Senate, and we've got the Democrats and the Republicans in America, and we've got similar everywhere else in the world. In law, it's adversarial, A versus B, so by which I mean it's normally the government against somebody, the law cases. And in business, we often see that as the best argument, or normally the loudest argument wins. And a lot of 20th century education is actually based on debate. The ultimate is Harvard University, Harvard Business School, where the only way you can get a grade, a positive grade, is by, in a room of 2 other people, is by winning your argument. So being loud. So there are a few examples in the current world, of course, of the dialogue or conversations, because that's what I believe to be the next paradigm for the 21st century, or part of the next paradigm. It requires diversity of perspectives, contextualized and embodied inclusivity, rich interactivity. And interesting, if you look at the root, the etymology of the words discussion and debate. Well, discussion comes from the Latin discutere, which actually means to dash to pieces or investigate by striking apart. And debate comes from the Old French battere, which means to combat, to argue, to fight, to beat. So you can see there, just in the roots of the word, it's very much a warlike type of approach. It's very adversarial. On the other hand, you've got conversation, which comes from the Latin con and versare. Con means together, and versare means to turn. So to turn together, which was actually, and it therefore meant to dance, because in a dance you're turning together. But it can also mean to change, because if you change together direction, you're actually changing. And dialogues comes from the Greeks dia and logos, and dia means through, and logos means word, or through the word, or the flow of meaning ultimately. So dialogue is very much a flow of meaning. So you can see, just looking even at the roots of the word, so we've got two very different word views. And we have been largely brought up so far more on the left-hand side, and where we need to shift more is towards the right, and that's where complexity also comes in. So how does complexity fit in this? Well, many of you are probably familiar with the Knuchel model from Dave Snowden, so I won't explain it in detail. The key differences are between complicated and complex. Complicated is more anything which is more sort of machine oriented, has a causal effect, a cause and effect, or a cause. A cause and effect, very often predictable and independent, so that each part is independent of the other parts. So if you press the brakes on your car, you won't suddenly have the headlights turn on, and they're completely disconnected. So everything is related, has a relationship. And therefore, to fix a complicated problem, you just need somebody who knows, a mechanic. You need an expert. Complex, however, is completely different, because the parts are interconnected and they do influence each other in such a way as to make a difference, which is why things become so unpredictable. So an example of complex is weather, the weather, parenting. There's plenty of complexity in parenting. So it's not something we don't know anything about. We know plenty about it. And there are very often no causal relationships, so they're very unclear. And unpredictability is also one aspect. But the person who explored complexity from a more academic perspective is Ralph Stacy. Now, he is somebody who's worked for 20 or so years, I believe, in industry. So he knows, he was a businessman basically, and he knows, he worked in the oil industry, I'm not 100% sure, and so he, in a big organization, so he knows organizational life, but then we went back to academic to study at the time complexity. Now, complexity science is much larger than what we're looking at here. Complexity science is a mathematical science, it's also computer science and so on. I'm only interested in that part that looks as complexity, but look at the part as it relates to humans. So not as it relates to computers and computer designs or other mathematical models. And this is what also Ralph Stacy was specialized. Although he did study the whole of complexity, he then focused on the human element. The key, most of what he was looking at, exploring, is the unpredictability of things. And so as long as there was a fair amount of agreement and there was also a fair amount of certainty, then in this diagram you see that would sort of fall under the ordinary management, and which is the predictable, really the predictable part. But the moment you veer away from it, you veer towards something. Well, I'm not sure that's his words actually. It's not his graph, but it's which is the unpredictable element, and that's the area where the complexity comes in. And he developed a very complicated or complex theory of complexity, which I have not read in any detail because it's far too complicated. It's very scientific and very academic, but in many ways, the key messages or the key message that come out from what I've seen is that given that there's so much unpredictability, it's a waste of time. Most management activities is a waste of time. That's fundamentally it isn't, because most management activity is about looking after predictability and using predictability tools in an unpredictable world. So which is total nonsense. It doesn't work. So I believe he created a huge complex theory in order to give a very bitter pill to managers to say, you're just wasting everybody's time. But anyway, but what he said. What he then focused on is, in order to be able to deal with that complexity, you need to be able to bring in the various perspectives and have what he called reflective inquiry, which is, again, although there was no direct relationship as far as I know between Bohm and what he wrote, is very similar to what Bohm was saying about the dialogue, the need to bring this emerge and bring in the different perspectives to look at very specific questions. And the key thing is, he also said that it's really important to focus on the right questions. And for me, that there's a message there, because I asked myself, do we in sociocracy always are we always asking ourselves, are we always examining whether we're asking ourselves the right questions, where we're looking at the decision or problem? Are we actually solving the right problem? Are we asking ourselves the right question? We don't have anything in the process actually to consider that. However, I do believe that picture forming is a good tool for that, because in the process of picture forming, that does brings out all kinds of different, can bring out different questions. But that's just a subplot. Just want to briefly introduce somebody else you haven't heard of, because he operates in the field of intercultural management. In other words, looking at different cultures around the world and understanding how they operate, the cultures and the assumption that go on in different cultures around the world. And he defined it, his research is focused around dilemmas. A dilemma. I mean, we have loads of dilemmas. So an example might be, okay, your friend has a crash. You were in the car with him, and this is one of his examples. You were in the car with him. He ran through a red light, so he was guilty, or he was at fault, and he had a crash. But he's your best friend. Now, what do? Do you stand up with your friend? You stand for your friend and lie to the courts and say no, he did nothing wrong, or do you betray him, your friendship, and say and stick to your principle? So that's an example. There's no right answer, but that's an example of a dilemma. So Trompen has been examining loads of dilemmas and looked at how different cultures attack those or answer those dilemmas. And what he found, because each individual will respond differently, but there are tendencies. So some cultures will tend to answer in one way, other countries will tend to answer in a different way. And through that, you can actually start getting a different sort of map of different cultures. The only reason I'm bringing this in here is because one of the key points he says is that we tend to treat dilemmas as decisions, and dilemmas are not decisions. And so we can often move in a wrong direction by making a decision where there isn't a decision to be made. For example, in the picture you see there, well, is this an oblong? On the right, is that a rhomboid or whatever the correct figure is, or is it a rectangle on the left? Well, depending on your perspective, it could be both. It is both. It's just it's the bridge from a different angle. So it's not, so by having the different perspectives and by asking the question in a different way, it's not an either or question, but it's moving your perspective. You can shift how you look at things. So a practical example in our current COVID-19 situation is the question, okay, should we focus on health or should we focus on the economy? At the moment, we're focusing on health, so the economy is practically coming to a halt. And of course, some people want to restart the economy at the cost of possibly at the cost of health. The problem there is again, if you treat it as a decision, then you're going to decide one way or the other, or you might choose some kind of compromise, also a fudge in the middle, but you're going to decide. And the more, what he calls the more intelligent way of looking at it is by reframing the question. So the kind of reframing question can be, in this case, for example, the example he gives is, what can we do to improve health, which then also stimulates the economy at the same time? Or vice versa, how can we revive the economy in such a way that it also improves health? So just by asking the question, because if we just ask the question, is it this or that, we get stuck, we can't move on. But by asking the question, it stimulates answers, and there's maybe thousands of answers, but having then the dialogue to be able to explore those questions is the key. And I've noted that the MIT in America have recently been referring to something similar, which they called multi-solving. So solving one problem, which also solves the other one at the same time. So the caution there, as it relates to sociocracy, is not to jump to decisions too quickly, and to consider reframing some of the questions we ask ourselves, and maybe even having a process to do that. And remember, decisions. The word decisions means to cut. Yeah, means to cut, and in other words, you're dividing. And so with so many decisions around, is it any wonder that we're in such a divided world, fragmented world? So maybe decisions are not the end all of everything. So maybe we shouldn't focus too much on decisions. So it's something to think about. So moving on to something quite different, more in the area of education. And I want to spend a lot of time there because this is Theo Dawson's work on VUCA skills, and I won't speak a lot of time on this because she's actually presented at SOFA about a year or two ago. I can't remember. So there is a recording if you want to read, see more detail. But fundamentally, she's saying, without going into the detail, there are certain skills that are not taught in schools, and that we really need to be able to manage and work with in VUCA. And VUCA is, of course, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so complexity being one of them. And these are some of the skills that she's mentioned. The key point I just want to raise here, because as I said, I'm not going into the detail, is simply that you can only learn these skills by actually doing them, by practicing them. It's not something you can learn in a book. You can only learn them by practice them. But the other thing, and that's a key point, and that's why it doesn't get learnt, is that you can't learn them by yourself. You can only learn them together with other people. It's a collaborative skill. It's not an individual skill. And these are the skills which are not taught in education, or certainly they weren't in my time, and I don't see much evidence that this is where we're sorely lacking. So we've got a deficiency in terms of our skills, which could be addressed. And the reason that relates to sociocracy is an ideal way of learning those skills. And when you think of it, the process, going the rounds, that forces you, if you're in a round, in a Socratic round, if you're in a round, first of all, you have to listen. There's no way around. You've got to listen. You've got to be able to take on everybody's perspective. You've got to start coordinating in your mind different perspectives, and it's a collaboration, but it's a coordination and integration skills. And you develop those skills simply, but the more you do it, the better you become at it. But it also explains why why many people coming into sociocracy, when they first do sociocracy, when they first do the rounds, they struggle with it. They struggle with the round. They struggle with this, and the reason is very simple. They think it's unnatural. Very often there's resistance. Unnatural is a word. Well, yes, it is unnatural because it's not what you've been taught. It's got nothing to do with nature. It's what your habits have taught you to do. And what our schooling teaches you to do. So there is really a process of unlearning and relearning new skills. So one of the key benefits I see in sociocracy is apart from the obvious, is also as an educational tool, a relearning educational tool. Right. So moving on to one last researcher on complexity, that's Mary Ulbein. So she has done a lot of research in complexity in the context of organizations and the leadership. And she defines complexity as rich interactivity, by which she means plenty of interconnectivity of the different agents and agents of the parts that interact in a complex system. So in an organization, that would normally be people, which enables emergence. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And again, she says complexity is different from complicated. She uses the airplane as an example of complicated, which has thousands of parts. But they all, but an engineer understands exactly what each of those parts do. So the expert can manage it. Whereas in a complex system, and she uses a mayonnaise as an example of a complex system, even though it appears very simple because there are only a few atoms. You've got the egg atoms and the oil atoms. But when they interact, they not only they transform, they influence each other, so that once they become mayonnaise, the original atoms are no longer, and you can't go back. So one of the key concepts is the influencing and the changing of each other. And so I've also often experienced people changing their mind in a sociocratic process. And they listen to each other, and suddenly when they see something from a different perspective, they say, oh, right, okay. And that enables, so that interaction that goes on in the rounds, which is a form of dialogue, enables also a certain element of changing. And that's also what goes on in Bohm dialogues and so on. That's that co-creative process. So something new emerges. So how do you work with complexity? Well, basically, her research shows that most managers and most leaders in organization, in the Western world at least, respond with order. They want to create order. So, which is the correct response in an ordered, predictable world. But when you go into the complex world, it produces exactly the opposite. It has the opposite effect. What it takes to meet, what she refers to as meeting complexity with complexity. So you create more complexity in order to meet complexity. You don't try to simplify and break it down. And hence that again, coming back to that rich interactivity, the interactivity of the different parts and the richness, which I'll come back to in a second. And one of the elements that she mentions is the adaptive process, what she calls the adaptive process, which is really a combination of connecting and conflicting. You need a certain amount of conflict, but you need that connectivity in order to bring about the next stage in dialogue. But the key thing there is really is the multiplicity of perspectives, what I call multiperspectivity, and the diversity, and this is that's what she refers to as rich. So it's not just having a small group, a group of people who have different perspectives about something. You really need, in an organization, you really need not just to look at the different parts of the organ and bring people in from the different parts. You even have to go outside of the borders of the organization itself, have to go beyond the borders. And so it's this it's this richness which is more important, and the cross pollination that happens as a result. Now this is the area which this is the area which I think Sociocracy does not quite fulfill that complex idea, because it does very well in a lot of things, but it doesn't, because we operate in circles, we tend not to bring in a different perspective. In certain, depending on the type of sociocratic organization you have, you might have a hierarchy, but it's not about hierarchy, because I mean the hierarchy that was created, part of them trying to coordinate things, but that misses the point, because the moment you've got a hierarchy, you've got certain focus who are only looking from a certain perspective. So what you need is this cross fertilization across the different perspectives and across the borders. And importance of it too is to be able to do that with time. So things do not happen from one day to another. So you need the dialogue and its interactivity to ferment, to germinate over time. It's like a seed, or it's like yogurt or something. It takes time until it actually things emerge. And that's very often we're a bit too quick to jump on some things. So I'm coming to the end here. So in conclusion, so what is leadership? Well, in complexity, complexity, you can't control complexity, you can't fix it, and certainly it's not a problem to be solved, even though you ask most managers and they say it's a problem. But it's not a problem to be solved. You've got to work with it, not against it. And so start from a position of ma, which is as a Japanese for empty space, or rather from unknowing. So your expertise actually hampers you. You need to go from a position of non-expertise. And reinvention is continuous adaptability, and it's never finished. And so one of the key elements there is emergence. And how do you create emergence? Well, dialogue with deep interactivity and gestation time, no agenda, no predetermined outcome, both observer, observed. We're all in it together, so to speak. We're all the co-creators. Invite all who care. The diversity of perspective is the key point, and go outside borders. To include other views. So a very different form of leadership, a different mindset than classical leadership. And you could almost say leadership is a process, to use Follett's words. And sociocracy, how does sociocracy fit in that picture? Well, from what I've just described, it's brilliant for VUCA in some ways, for VUCA skills. As I've explained this, it teaches some great skills, some multi-mind, coordination, both and thinking, all that stuff is great. And it's a great way to unlearn the debating that we've been taught and relearn dialogue. Some cautionary notes I've mentioned, well, don't make everything a decision. Instead, consider reframing the questions. So look at exploring different questions, and picture forming is an excellent. We should be using a lot more picture forming and things like that, a lot more, and avoid premature decision making, because we need to allow time for gestational ideas. However, having said that, probing and trying things out, safe enough for try, is definitely part of that gestation process, because you've got to be able to prototype and try things out. So trying things out, that's great. But the key thing, so these are just cautionary, but the key thing, the one thing that Sociocracy does not meet is that rich interactivity criteria, the need for multi-perspective, which is beyond just in the circles. We need to go beyond the circles, include others in certain dialogue forms. So it does. So if we're aware of that, then we can. Then it seems that we can approach Sociocracy in a brilliant way. And one possible solution, well, has been suggested by, well, so far it's the only suggestion I've come across, but I may be wrong, is John Buck's Bossa Nova, sorry, and his combination with other technologies like open space. But that's just the question I'll throw open and we can discuss. So how else might we achieve a Bohm or Stacy type of dialogue with rich multiperspectivity, serendipitous pollination, which is self-organized chaotic authenticity, and emergent co-creation, to be able to continuously reinvent our work, because it's a continuous process. And that's the question I'd like to throw open for us to discuss. But I'll open it for questions first, and then we can go into little groups. So thank you for this. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the conversation.